Hare Krishna, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is part 6 of my series on the Sri Upanishad. So I've called this series the Bhakti Upanishad series because this is one of the Upanishads that's especially dear to those who practice Bhakti Yoga. So if you haven't started from the beginning of this series, I recommend going back to the start before watching this one because every mantra in this ancient text builds on the previous mantra. And so there's kind of a progression in what we're learning in this. Now, in the meantime, I just want to remind everybody that, let me pull my screen a little bit bigger. There you go. This is the book, the Sri Upanishad, and you can order it on Amazon. Look for the translation from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Is the Bhakti monk who brought the Hare Krishna Bhakti Yoga to the United States in the 1960s. So if you saw yogis in the airports handing out Bhagavad Gitas and singing and dancing, kind of was a part of the countercultural revolution during the 60s. Really interesting. It's a lot different now today. The movement has turned into a much more organized system, and had to really figure that out after the founder, the Acharya, the monk that I just mentioned, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, passed away. They were a young movement and had a lot of stuff to figure out. And it's been really interesting to study the history of the Hare Krishna movement. I mentioned this a few days ago, or maybe last week. There's a documentary that you could watch if you're interested called Hare Krishna, and the subtitle is like the mantra, the movement, and the Swami behind it all. It's a really interesting historical documentary that you could check out. Anyway, so back to the Sri Upanishad. Today we are on mantra number 5. Remember, there's 17 mantras plus the invocation. And so the Sri Upanishad is, of course, part of the tradition of philosophical commentaries upon the Vedas, which are called the Upanishads. And this particular Upanishad is called the Upanishad of the Lord. Isha means Lord. It was written in poetic verse. It consists of 18 verses plus 17 plus an invocation. So this is the 5th mantra. Let's read it together. And I encourage you to read it along with me. The Supreme Lord walks and does not walk. He is far away, but he is very near as well. He is within everything, and again, he is outside of everything. Let's read it once more. The Supreme Lord walks and does not walk. He is far away, but he is very near as well. He is within everything, and again, he is outside of everything. Now, this verse, let's start breaking it down little by little. Let's start by looking at a purport that comes from Srila Prabhupada from the translation that he wrote. These two phrases are contradictory. If someone can walk, then it is improper to say that he cannot walk. These contradictions show the inconceivable power of God. With our limited fund of knowledge, we cannot accommodate such things, and therefore the Lord is conceived in terms of our limited power of understanding. The impersonalist philosophers of the Mayavad school accept only the impersonalist part of the Lord's activities and refute his personal feature. The Bhagavat school, however, accepts the Lord in both ways, i.e., as personal and impersonal. So that's pretty philosophically rich, and we need to break that down a little bit. Let's go back to the mantra. The Supreme Lord walks and does not walk. He is far away, but he is very near as well. He's within everything, and again, he is outside of everything. So there is a way in which God embodies simultaneously opposites that seem to be contradictory. This is why, for example, we say that God is both many and one simultaneously, both transcendent and immanent simultaneously. That there is also a sense in which we said acyuta-bhava tattva, that the jiva, the soul, is at one with God, but is also simultaneously separate, apart from, and completely autonomous. Of course, not ever completely, because the jiva is also simultaneously at one with God. So it seems like a paradox. It is a paradox. It seems like a contradiction. It's a paradox. So this mantra is getting at the heart of that same kind of paradox about God. God walks and doesn't walk, that God is far away and very near. God is within everything and yet apart from everything. And then Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada says that the really important comment that he's making here is that there are some schools of yoga philosophy that will suggest that God is not personal, that God is only impersonal. And actually, in Bhakti, what we believe is that God is both personal and impersonal. So what does that mean? What does it mean to say that God is personal and that God is impersonal? Well, God is near and God is far. So although God is vast, distant, and in some ways impossible for us to understand, Krishna is also within all things, at their center, facilitating the relationships between all things and available to us in the most immediate and personal ways. So that is to say that even though there's this feeling that God is great and vast and powerful and that we're very small in comparison, that God also makes itself very small and accessible and very personal to us at the exact same time. In Bhakti, we can be very far away from God through turning our consciousness away from God and into the sensorial objects, meaning, what am I going to eat? What am I going to do to please myself or to be happy with my senses and material things? That can get pretty sophisticated. You know, people use their material senses to work toward goals of all kinds. But anytime we're striving to find happiness apart from God in the material energy, it's like we're vast oceans apart from God. But at the exact same time, as soon as we turn our consciousness toward God, even when we're within this material world, there's a sense in which the distance is bridged just like that, and God is right there in the heart talking to us if we choose to reach out. So we also say similarly that God is a personal being. You could literally just say in Bhakti that we say God is a person, like you or me, or like your dog or a butterfly outside. If you ever looked at your dog and you go, you know, my dog's a person. Yes, that is the exact philosophy of Bhakti Yoga. Your dog is a person. So is every living thing is a being, is a person. And that beingness is separate, apart, unique. So sometimes in yoga philosophy, there will be a desire to merge all things. For example, you'll say, well, I am you and you are me and we are all together, right? And yes, on one level, because we are all aspects of God, God's energies, God's diverse energies and manifestations, there is a sense in which, you know, we're all the same. But there is a simultaneous sense in which we are never all the same, because we are also always each unique. And that never goes away. And the point of enlightenment is not to merge with God and lose that individual feature of identity. In Bhakti Yoga, we want to maintain the soul's individuality, uniqueness, and apartness, because it is what facilitates relationships with other beings and with God. And it's that relationship that Bhakti Yoga is really interested in. Bhakti Yoga says, therefore, God is a person. God is a being that we can have personal relationships with, because God is actually a separate being from us. At the same time, there's an inconceivable way in which God is the ground of being that we both share in. So God is both simultaneously. His beingness comes from the fact that he comes from, we could say it like this, his beingness, just that kind of pure, undifferentiated beingness, comes from the fact that he is a separate individual person. We say he, and I'll be exploring in a future video why we use the word he versus she. It's more of a yin and yang thing. It's not really a literal, you don't have to think about it as a literal gender or a literal sex. But God is both simultaneously. God's beingness as a person, as an individual being, comes from being a person. And his person expresses his beingness. So, for example, if you think of the sun, the light of the sun comes from the fact that the sun is a sun. And in that way, the sense of the sun being light and having this undifferentiated sunlight rays of sunlight energy comes from the fact that the sun is a sun. So similarly, the fact that there are so many energies emanating from God, of which we are one, right? It is because God is God that the beingness emanates from God. But in Bhakti, we say that it's not the point to go and merge with God, that there's a need to retain some sense of autonomy. So when we go back to that purport, The impersonalist philosophers of the Mayavad school accept only the impersonalist part of the Lord's activities and refute his personal feature. What that means is that they see the sameness and they see the oneness, but they don't validate the apartness or the separateness. And in that sense, they can't ever come to know God as person. They can't come to know God person to person. They can only get to know God in terms of some kind of undifferentiated beingness. The reason that we also reject that in bhakti is because that effectively is a rejection of individuality. And individuality is thought to be a beautiful God-given feature of reality, that things are endowed with their own godly individual autonomy. And so this is a really important part of what this verse is actually getting at, because this verse is kind of explicating the simultaneousness that God can occupy, both being apart and being together, both being far and both being near. Bhakti also means spiritualizing our existence, and we can't do that in some ways unless there is something to spiritualize, right? So there, for example, in this material world, because God is both near and far, anything in the material world can become the means by which we draw close to God. So, for example, we can use, bhakti will make use of whatever is near in the material energy in order to reach out through it in devotion to God. So this is also a form of yoga that is not about renunciation of the material world or the material energy, because we see this as one of God's energies. The material energy, in other words, is not just some pure illusion, and your individuality is not an illusion, and my individuality is not an illusion, and the world isn't an illusion. These are all God's energies. They have their own unique autonomy. They all have their own unique agency. And so the important thing is not to renounce the material world like it's unreal compared to the spiritual real thing. In a sense, what it is meant to do is to reject the material, a certain kind of relationship with God, or a certain kind of relationship with the material energy. And that is the kind of relationship that turns away from God deliberately and then experiences a kind of illusory, perverted relationship with God. It's like, being in a marriage but giving someone the silent treatment as if they don't exist. What we're trying to do in Bhakti Yoga is come back, turn our focus back to that relationship. And so therefore we need to use whatever is around us as a way of seeing God and connecting with God. So rather than renouncing anything in the material world in favor of the spiritual world, we choose to see the world as God and therefore use what's in the world as a way of connecting to God. Now, that doesn't mean that you can use just anything. At the end of the day, it is truly about using things in a spiritual manner. But in Bhakti Yoga, we focus on things like flowers, heavenly scents like incense, and flowers and earth and water on the altar, and fire and candles, and worshiping the deities, and singing and dancing, and making food to offer the deities and then receive. We use human relationships and the joy that we have of congregating to talk about God and to sing about God as a way of using human relationships to contact God. Chanting the names of God, reading about God, talking about God. That we do these things with devotion and love and enthusiasm, the world around us turns from being something that feels apart or separate from God or even an illusion into being a material energy of God that comes into the service of our spiritual development because we're using it in service of God. So now, in order to do that, though, we have to recognize the individuality and uniqueness of each individual thing. So yes, there's oneness, but there's also separateness. And that's also how we get from God being far away to God being very, very near, is through bridging that gap by making what's near into something to connect with what's far. So this is some of the esoteric philosophy. I know it's a little heady, but it's quite beautiful, right? I find it so attractive. In the Bhagavad Gita, there's a verse that Krishna says. There's a verse where Krishna is speaking, and he says, "My dear Arjuna, only by undivided devotional service can I be understood as I am, standing before you, and can thus be seen directly. Only in this way can you enter into the mysteries of my understanding." So where is this taking place? Well, in the Bhagavad Gita, at this point in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna has just been granted a vision of the Lord's universal form. You see that big oneness form, that big everythingness form. And he sees it, but it turns out that he's overwhelmed by it, terrified, and that it disturbs his mind. And that he feels like he's losing his sanity. He's losing his grip. He's losing himself. So he pleads with God. He says, thank you for showing me, Krishna, but I'd really prefer it if you could come back into the form that I'm used to, standing here before me with two arms, you know. So Krishna comes back into that form and he says, really the form that I'm in before you right now, standing like a person that you're used to seeing, that looks like you know, like this, like personal, that you can only see me like this in this personal form when you approach me through devotion and love. That is, and it's only by approaching me with devotion and love and coming to see me as a person, just like you, that you will enter into the mysteries of my understanding. Profound. It's really a way of saying the more personal you get with God, the more that God's vastness becomes accessible, because it's not coming through a lens that is overwhelming. We're just little jivas. We're just little souls, you know? So think of how big we look to an ant, you know what I mean? And then think about how small we may be to the demigods or to, you know, other beings, what to speak of God. So to have a relationship with God that's very personal, God will take a form that's very familiar and safe to us, and like that. And that's actually the form that we're going for in Bhakti, is the personal form. And we don't want to be overwhelmed and lose ourselves into some vast oneness. That's not the goal of Bhakti. The oneness we're looking for comes through the simultaneous way in which we retain our own natures. Because our natures are beautiful. They don't need to be erased or eliminated. Even though ego death is a part, and renunciation of sort is a part of Bhakti Yoga, we're not into rejecting things. We're into loving things. All the different kinds of worshipers, this comes from the Srimad Bhagavatam, all the different kinds of worshipers of multi-demigods can attain the highest perfectional benediction, which is spontaneous attraction, unflinchingly fixed upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead, only by the association of the pure devotee of the Lord. All of the different kinds of worshipers of multi-demigods can attain the highest perfectional benediction, which is spontaneous attraction, unflinchingly fixed upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead, only by the association of the pure devotee of the Lord. In Bhakti, we also say, leave this last thought for today. In Bhakti, we also say that this isn't something that you get just by effort, right? Like just by sitting and being like, okay, I'm really going to love God, and then I'm going to see God. And then, you know, and then it's going to be this really personal relationship because I've really like chanted a lot, or I've really, you know, like meditated a lot. Other forms of yoga are often more about renunciation, merging into God through a Olympian, you know, at the Olympic level of meditation, right? This form of yoga, it says, not only is it about a personal relationship, and everyone knows that a personal relationship can't be, you know, you can't really compete for it and try to win it. You would objectify a person if you did that, right? But instead, you have to come to know and have personal relationships with people who are closer to God personally than you are. And that's hard for us because we want to think that everyone's relationship with God is equal and it's an equal opportunity for everybody. But some people, and God doesn't privilege or favor anybody. The scriptures are very clear about this in the Bhakti Yoga tradition. However, some people know God better because they've been spending a longer amount of time hanging out with God and serving God and loving God. And so in Bhakti Yoga, we say the thing that really helps us is having personal connections to people who are absorbing their life in love of God and thinking about God, in chanting God's names. And, you know, so in this verse, we say the best, highest benediction you could ever get from any kind of effort that you put into anything would be to obtain deep, pure, unflinching love of God. That would be the highest thing you could ever earn by trying to accomplish something. And yet, you can only get this if you hang out personally with people who are more realized than you are, or who are really devoted to this path already, because it's a personal path. So you get to know God by knowing people that God hangs out with. And that's the simple truth of bhakti as well. Sadhu Sangha. You need the association of saintly people who love God and love to talk about God and love to hang out with God. No one's perfect. So another big thing that comes into bhakti yoga is that we have to be very careful that we tend to those relationships with a lot of care and love, really being forgiving of each other, because these relationships with people who also love God in our life are some of the best medicine that we have. And yet, nobody's perfect. We're all trying. We're all learning to love God. And so there's a way in bhakti yoga that we keep these relationships, especially by associating with people who love to talk about God and doing that with our times rather than other frivolous things with each other, and then not criticizing one another and forgiving each other. Anyway, so that is mantra. What was that? Mantra number 5. So the Supreme Lord walks and does not walk. He is far away, but is very near as well. He's within everything, and again, he's outside of everything. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk. More to come in the next talk. And please leave your comments. Tell me how you're enjoying the series. I'd love to hear from you and love to hear some of your takeaways and reflections. Okay, take it easy. Hare Krishna.